actually have some physical engineering function with its descending passage and subterranean pit for the purpose known only to God on Judgment Day? It is on this day that the Creator becomes destroyer, and not of the world only, but even the very fabric of the souls of men will on that day be condemned. The purpose of Giza was to hide something of grave importance to humanity, a secret guarded so closely that it is unimaginably obvious to the extent that we are blinded by its truth. Almost suspiciously, the stele near the Sphinx reads, "Thou hast built for thee a place protected in the sacred desert with hidden name." There is something spiritually compelling about the Giza monuments that drives men to travel great distances just to look upon its outer surfaces. For thousands of years, people have come from lands at the edges of the world to see the pyramids. Some of the people compelled their cultures to attempt to replicate these buildings, and soon after, these lesser monuments became centers of pilgrimage. Several hundred pyramids wrap around the world within the geographical area known as the Pyramid Belt, extending from China all the way to the dense jungles and high mountains of America. Pyramids within this belt have even been discovered on dozens of seemingly insignificant islands and even under the sea. This massive pyramid copying campaign ended abruptly with massive geologic upheavals and flooding all along the equatorial zones of the Pyramid Belt, tremendous earthquakes and volcanism that has occurred periodically since the Great Deluge. In Abu Fedah's Historia Anti-Islamica, it is stated that Syria was one of the earliest inhabited countries, and that the Syriac language was the first that was spoken, that the Sabaean language was established by Seth and Idris, Enoch, that there was a town called Haran in which pilgrims resorted as they did so to the large pyramids of Giza, one of which was said to be the tomb of Idris. This is Enoch. This was confirmed by another Arab writer who said that pilgrims made trips to visit the Great Pyramid. This was Ibn al-Latif, and he claimed to have read in the books of the Sabaeans that one of the pyramids was the tomb of Agathodamon and the other of Hermes. Agathodamon was the person of Seth, and Hermes would be the person of Enoch. Idris, the Enoch of the Arabic Quran, was not buried there, but the mentioning of his name in reference to the pyramids of Giza serves to show that even the Arabian religious writings, at least in part, were ultimately borrowed from a parent source. Haran was the land of Chaldeans and is the origin of the people historians have come to call Hurrians. It was also where Abraham lived with his father Terah. Abraham lived during the reign of King Nimrod, who was several years earlier the king of Akkad and is identified on Sumerian records as Amar-Udak. Actually, the Hebrew patriarch Abram was also of direct Sumerian descent, as was most of Babylonia. He was called a Hebrew, meaning sojourner, and as such he lived up to his name, for he traveled and spent years of his life in Canaan, Philistia, Egypt, and Syria. Too many today assume the early Hebrews were racially different than the Babylonians, and such is false, for Abram was Chaldean, a holy man separated from his culture by a fervent yearning to obey the will of God. Of great interest to this study is that Abram went to Egypt according to Genesis, and other Hebraic records tell that he traveled to Egypt more than once. The book of Jasher reveals that Abram was famous throughout Babylonia and Canaan for his testimony against the evils of the king of Babylon, Nimrod, or Amar-Udak.
1111 PCH number 2, Harbor City, 310-876-7613. Iron 1 Beef TH, get a free day. New 2 grams disposables.
And his household
2.
servants trained in war and his Amorite allies in Canaan. He was raised in the house of Noah, who was at that time very old and looked after by the Semitic peoples living in Canaan. Under Noah's tutoring, Abram became learned in the secrets and sciences of the antediluvian world. He became a student of pre-flood astronomy and was initiated into the hidden mysteries of timekeeping under the earlier draconian calendrical systems and the newer post-apocalyptic modified systems of all scribal lore and chronological histories. Noah and Shem taught Abram firsthand the history of the world before the flood and the prophetic writings of their forefathers concerning the end of the world and the return of God to earth. Abram also studied the writings of Enoch, which were at the time inscriptions also studied by his great-grandson Simeon. The Quran tells that Abraham left behind a book of writings himself. Much of the teachings of Noah were from the books that he preserved upon the ark. Noah's wisdom and knowledge was immense. Having lived under the pristine climate and atmospheric conditions of the world prior to the deluge, he was a man born under better genetic circumstances that allowed him to live so long. He was already 600 years old at the cataclysm, and if the Sumerian records are true, Noah was the king of the city of Shurappak long before prior to the flood. Having spent 40 years learning from this ancient man, Abraham himself was a remarkable repository of information. He was the only man on earth 350 years after the flood, when Noah died, to fully grasp the spectrum of mysteries of God, both before and after the deluge. Abraham visited Egypt with this information, and it is this author's belief that such an incredible man could never have left Egypt unaffected. Hebraic traditional writings hold that Abraham went to Egypt and taught the astrologers and wise men of Pharaoh's court great secrets of God hidden in the stars and celestial motions. Such a claim is also confirmed in the Masonic document called the Wood Manuscript, which dates from 1610 AD. The Wood Manuscript claims that the sciences and knowledge taught by Abraham had been derived from one of the pillars that had been discovered, and that as one learned in the scribal mysteries of the Sumerians, Abraham himself understood these writings and related them to the Egyptians. This pillar was one of the Giza pyramids covered in minute inscriptions from the pre-flood world seen by the baffled Greek and Roman historians almost 2,000 years later. The Masonic Inigo Jones document cited the same information. However, Abraham here is substituted for Hermes. It is clear that Abraham is the subject of the context. However, because the text claims the antediluvian writings were found upon excavated pillars that were translated by a minister to Osiris, king of Egypt, during the reign of Ninus, who was Nimrod according to the Assyrians. Alexandrian historians identified two distinct Hermes figures. The first was the builder of the pillars, and the second was much later. It was the second Hermes that found the pillars and translated them, according to Iamblichus, who wrote that this second Hermes lived after the flood. And this would no doubt be Abraham, who, according to this Inigo Jones document, taught the ancient Egyptians the zodiac and the secrets of the stars, hieroglyphics, and diverse sciences. Such is further substantiated in the book of Jasher, which states that in the days of Abraham, the king of Egypt was Osiris, the son of Mina. The Jasher account extensively outlines Nimrod's life and reign, and even his personal experiences with Abram, the son of one of his favored Babylonian war generals. The connection between Osiris, second ruler of Egypt, and Nimrod of Chaldea is nothing short of astonishing, for Nimrod's name in Assyrian was Ninus. But even more incredible is the evidence that this minister to the Egyptian ruler was in fact Abram. Cyrillus Alexandrinus in Contra Julianum wrote that long ago a powerful Chaldean visited Egypt, a man of immense wisdom. Such a historical reference would not have been recorded if the stranger had not left a powerful impact upon the Egyptian people at such a remote time in the culture's infancy. Many Chaldeans have visited Egypt. If such an incredibly wise man of learning did visit Pharaoh's court, then such an event could not have remained unacknowledged in Egypt's archives. Setting aside the apparent anachronisms so prevalent in interpretations of Egyptian history, we learn that an Egyptian record called the Westcar Papyrus does tell that during the reign of Khufu, a foreigner visited Egypt, a venerable man of 110 years age who was believed to be able to perform miracles but was known greatly for his vast wisdom. Of particular fascination to the sages of Pharaoh's court was the fact that this stranger to Egypt was acquainted with the mysteries of Thoth, Enoch. Abram was a Chaldean by birth and a savant of the mysteries of Enoch through Noah and Enoch's inscriptions upon the tablets kept safe by the Sethites after the flood. At age 110, Abram was living among the Philistines at the eastern borders of the land of Egypt, so it is not improbable that he could have spent a considerable amount of time translating these pillars, the pyramid inscriptions at Giza, for the Egyptians. The Greek historian Herodotus may have inadvertently recorded this as well. Concerning the pyramids at Giza, he wrote that they had been built by one called Philition, which merely is a Grecian title meaning native of Philly. He was also called Philistus, a shepherd who frequently fed his flocks near Giza. In Civilization or Barbarism, Sheikh Anta Diop on page 281 wrote it was Philistus who brought the secrets of the calendar into Egypt, exactly what is said of Thoth, Hermes, and Enoch. The Westcar Papyrus reveals that this 110-year-old man knew the number of the chambers of Thoth. Some Egyptologists interpreting this to mean secret chambers of the primeval sanctuary, according to Zechariah Sitchin in The Wars of Gods and Men. This visitor to Egypt of old claimed to know where the plans with numbers were hidden. This, no doubt, was what Abraham found inside the primeval sanctuary, or Great Pyramid. It is quite possible that he did not build these monuments, but because of his own fame, he was later identified with them. All of this further identifies Abraham, who was a shepherd and a nomad who was living in the area of the Philistine city of Gerar when he was 110 years old. It is obvious that after the passage of so many years, the historical accounts of different scribes and records would have become slightly confused. It is not a stretch of the imagination to assume that the Egyptians would have later credited this stranger with building the monuments if he had been remembered as the one who had translated the mysterious writings found upon them. All evidence points that the enigmatic writings of the Book of the Dead, as well as some of the older biblical records and the ancient writings of many early civilizations, merely borrowed their source materials from the inscriptions preserved through the flood that were engraved into the faces of the Great Pyramid. Though Egyptologists claim that the writings that constitute the Book of the Dead were so extensive that they required editing and abbreviation into shorter works to be adequately used, this appears to be the case with most of the world's ancient historical writings. This is especially the case with the little understood and mysterious Edfu wall text. Discovered in Upper Egypt to the far south of Egypt was an archive of ancient glimpses into an even earlier past that appear to have been unique to Edfu. Even more peculiar is that the Edfu writings tell of the plans for a great temple that predated the other temples of Egypt that dropped out of heaven near Memphis, and that Imhotep built this edifice according to these plans. Memphis is the area of the Giza Plateau, only a few miles between them. What's interesting is that these Edfu records were found on the far side of Egypt to the deep south, on the edges of Nubia, instead of near Memphis. These plans are the divine instructions received by Enoch concerning the architectural dimensions of the Great Pyramid. The Edfu inscriptions tell the distant history of Egypt concerning the first time, Zep-Tepi, the primordial sages, primeval gods, the abyssal waters of the Nun that existed prior to the creation of our world, of alien gods before the Egyptian deities, an enemy in the visage of a serpent, and a great conflict that brought this earlier world to a devastating end. Linking these writings to the Book of the Dead and the Great Pyramid is the fact that these writings are attributed to Thoth. Andrew Collins in Gods of Eden, Egypt's Lost Legacy and the Genesis of Civilization, cites that these strange writings and he cites these strange writings and goes on to write that all of the inhabitants of this earlier world perished, and when the world was brought back out of the darkness of ruin, the world contained the ghosts of this earlier civilization. The only relic to have survived this judgment was the single Dyad pillar located in the Field of Reeds. This would serve to identify the Delta area and surrounding regions where Giza lies, for the Field of Reeds is adjacent to the Sea of Reeds, commonly referred to in Scripture as the Red Sea, crossed by the Israelites fleeing Egypt. The story is the same the world over, but the more it is told, the more fascinating the parallels become. The Babylonian historian Berosus wrote that the god Kronos bade Xisuthros, a version of Noah, to set down a writing of the beginning, the middle, and the end of all things before the flood. This god told his earthly servant that after the deluge, he was to go and recover the writings, publish them for all men to see. The account reads that these writings were located after the catastrophe and dug up. Assuming arguendo that these were merely small books, then why not just take them all in the ark? This author believes these books were not small, nor was it possible to have taken such a vast archive of knowledge through the cataclysm, but that they were meticulously inscribed upon the Great Pyramid's surfaces, and there were originally 4 of these gigantic books that correspond to the 4 faces of the monument, just as there were 4 Gospels given to men, different versions of the same messianic story, and there stand 4 Watcher Guardians around the throne of God. Though embellishments crept into the account, the exaggerations focused on localizing the tradition to Babylon rather than on the material facts that collaborate the hundreds of other legends and myths from other nations in antiquity. We find additional collaboration in India, where again the same operable facts remain the same, but the traditions are centrally focused within the subcontinent. There is an immense aura of mystery attached to India. Its culture is an enduring one, and recently research has shown the apparent relationships between the Indian and Sumerian pictographic languages. In fact, no other civilization exists today aside from India that so closely mirrored ancient Sumer. They have maintained their traditions for millennia, beliefs derived from the mysterious Sanskrit and Vedic writings, whereas those nations surrounding them have almost entirely succumbed to the relatively newer Islamic faith. India is a window into the past. The Vedic scriptures are commonly believed by those in India as being eternal, having existed in the mind of the deity since the beginning. They were considered the knowledge of God himself, divine information imparted unto the rishis, who in turn took this knowledge and wrote the 4 Vedas from the 4 mouths of Brahma, the creator. The 7 rishis took this knowledge and wrote it down for the benefit of mankind. Brahma was believed to have 4 faces, which this author believes is a signal characteristic that links the creator to the Great Pyramid symbolism. Even in the book of Revelation, the throne of God has 4 faces. The Great Pyramid does not factor in anywhere in the Vedic writings. However, the ideas of which they embody is clearly seen in the arcane texts. The 4 Vedas of Brahma are said in these writings to have sprung from the Gayatri shortly after Brahma finished framing the world. The most sacred meter in the Vedic text is the Gayatri, a metrical speech consisting of 3 times 8 syllables. The Aryans believed that the syllables of words could be measured out to form a divine speech. The Gayatri speech is associated to fire and express the idea of Brahma. Interestingly, the Vedic man had to employ this sacred metrical speech when attempting to acquire sacred knowledge and the thorough understanding of all problems of theology. Like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was clearly copied from an older source from an entirely different language, so too were the original Vedic records in an alien language very different from the Sanskrit that they had presently survived in. Translator Ralph Griffith wrote in his The Vedas, 1892, that the language of the Vedas is an older dialect, varying very considerably, but in its grammatical and lexical character from the classical Sanskrit. Its grammatical peculiarities run through all departments. For the critic who still remains unyielding to such a connection between Giza and these most ancient writings from India and other classical civilizations, I defer now to actual Sanskrit in order to banish any further disbelief. The Great Pyramid was designed to convey knowledge and was long ago called an altar by old Semitic cultures. With this in mind, we find an amazing parallel to learn that the Sanskrit word for Veda is in fact knowledge, which incidentally is a very old word etymologically related to the Sanskrit Vedi, or altar. Y'all excuse me, I'm high on caffeine. Further, like the Book of the Dead writings discovered and excavated by the early Egyptians, the Vedic beliefs were that the gods long ago dug up the Vedic writings. This too is the testimony of the Hindus, who assert that their holy books long ago were recovered from the bottom of the ocean after the flood, as found in the classic research of Ignatius Donnelly in the Antediluvian World on page 303. Also, the most sacred of the holy books was the Rig Veda, which has exactly 10,800 verses in Sanskrit, ancient scriptures told to correspond to the 10,800 bricks of the altar of the fire god Agni. This altar is that spoken of by the prophet Isaiah that stands in the land of Egypt. And for those of you who have read my Chronicon, you know that the Great Pyramid was finished in the year 1080 Annus Mundi.
You want them? I'll go get them right now.
Abraham was an initiate. He was an initiate to this arcanum. He knew of the altar of God in Egypt and its hidden identity as the pillar of Enoch that represented the holy mountain of heaven and its function as a terrestrial gateway between heaven and earth in the underworld. He translated these mysteries for the Egyptians and wrote his own records as well, which have been preserved in Genesis and within obscure passages in the Psalms. There is every possibility that he discovered the writings of the Apocalypse upon the faces of the stones of the pyramid. The Revelation record as recorded by John is truly a masterpiece of ancient symbolism and extinct motifs. It was written in Greek, but the Greeks nor Hebrews could have understood it 2,000 years ago because the language of symbolism employed is specifically Sumerian. The end of the world was written in the signs, motifs, symbols, language, and imagery that could have only been truly comprehended by those who lived in the beginning prior to the deluge. Unfortunately, this shocking and informative study is the subject of an entirely different book and is not the objective of this present study. Suffice it to say that we infer this from the fact that according to the manifold sources already cited in this book, upon the faces of the Great Pyramid was written the past, the present, and the future. The knowledge, Vedas, was learned by Abraham, and after centuries passed, the priests of India preserved his name in the name they referred to as God himself, Brahma, which is the same as Abram, with the initial A vowel worn off. That Abraham of Genesis is alluded to can be no doubt. His wife is Sarah, and later Sarai, just as the Vedic god Brahma was married to Saraswati. Abraham's ministry to Earth's earliest post-apocalyptic civilizations was no accident, for the work of Abraham's translation of these holy mysteries to the world was the result of an Enochian prophecy almost a millennia prior to the flood. The Book of the Secrets of Enoch reads that after the flood shall arise another generation much afterwards. He who raised that generation, Abram, shall reveal to them the books of thy handwriting, Enoch's, of thy fathers, to them to whom he must point out the guardianship of the world, to the faithful men and workers of my pleasure, who do not acknowledge my name in vain. The early Egyptians learned through the wise Abram the contents of the glyphic writings at Giza and immediately incorporated these mysteries into their theology. These translations often meant nothing to the Egyptians other than they were of divine importance and were words and phrases needed in the afterlife. Egyptologists admit that it was often the case that even Egyptian scribes long ago meticulously preserved hieroglyphic texts even though they themselves did not quite understand the meanings of the text themselves. These inscriptions were placed inside tombs, upon temple walls as walk-in books, within coffins, on artwork on beads inside crypts, and on obelisks that were erected everywhere throughout Egypt. One can read the Book of the Dead, which is a compilation of these texts from all over Egypt, from what has come to be called the Papyrus of Ani, and see clearly that these writings have little, if anything, to do with Egypt. They are full of obscure imagery like the Ladder of Set and the Pillars of Thoth that hint to an older theology, one extant long prior to the traditional Egyptian pantheon. There is a mystery these writings seek to explain that involves the secrets of resurrection in the name of God, the divine key to the arcanum known as eternal life. When Abraham first laid eyes on the excavation at Giza and witnessed the pyramids rising out of the sands of the desert waste almost 4,000 years ago, he knew he was looking at an earthly model of the city of God, placed there by his antediluvian Sethite forebears. The spiritual city where the eternal righteous will dwell lieth foursquare, and the length is as large as the breadth. The length and the breadth and the height are all equal. A perfect equilateral cube. The Great Pyramid is a shadow of this greater and future reality. The celestial city of the Greeks is the same as the divine tree of the Hebrews, both being images of the same archetype, an ideal cosmology as noted by John Mitchell in The Dimensions of Paradise. The Gnostics too shared this concept. The Pistis Sophia text reads, "For God shall save their souls from all matters, and a city shall be prepared in the like, and all the souls saved will dwell in the city and inherit it, and the soul of them who receive mysteries will abide in that region." The pyramid at Giza embodied terrestrial mysteries, and its angle relates specifically to the earth, but the pyramidal city of God will be perfect, all its points equidistant. In the New Testament book of Hebrews is a curious fragment that reads that Abraham did look for a city whose builder and maker was God. Because we have no biblical reference to such a historic quest by the patriarch, we know that he did not look with earthly eyes. Abraham looked upon the monuments of Giza with spiritual sight that prophetically witnessed the coming of the city of God. Rostau and the resurrection. In Egypt of old, all men feared the kingdom of Seker. He was the death god, older than Osiris, and his realm was filled with the blackest darkness beneath walls of sand. His shrine was pyramidal, and the gate to his nether kingdom was called Rostau. It was here that the souls of the dead drifted through subterranean chambers and halls and expansive galleries of rock, alone in utter darkness. However, the souls of the deserving can be assisted in this dreaded journey after death by the aid of the god Thoth. With so many gods in Egypt, why Thoth? This can perhaps be explained because it was Thoth who was associated to the Giza complex and the secret mysteries of death. Rostal was more than a simple gateway, but a place of passage wherein lived the secret to resurrection. To remain in the kingdom of Seeker was certain death, but through Rostal, one could get out of Seeker and enter into the Tuat, or the other world. Rostal literally was a door of the corridors of the mountain. And it is evident by the writings of the Book of the Dead that where one chose to go in Rostal determined his fate. Imagine a labyrinth. To the Egyptian, Seeker was a darkened desert region, a waste that represented death itself, and the only way out was to find the door to Rostal, which led into galleries and chambers of rock that in themselves had choices leading to different destinations within this massive gateway, such as what we find embodied in the architecture of Giza. Once one enters the Great Pyramid, he begins a steep descent into the monument. If one does not know where to look up, which would be the secret of the mysteries of Thoth, then he will walk all the way, he will crawl all the way down to below the pyramid into the bowels of the earth, into a subterranean chamber with a well pit, told by the ancients to descend all the way into the abyss. A prison realm made by the Creator wherein ageless beings, fallen angels, and evil men reside until the judgment. But if one does know where to seek the hidden door, an entrance into the ascending corridors of the pyramid, then he will pass through the grand gallery and ultimately find the Holy of Holies in the Great Pyramid. It is there that he will discover that the ceremonies of the Book of the Dead are symbolic of the mysteries of Thoth, which are done in the Kirneder, the grave. In the area called the King's Chamber, the disembodied spirit of the dead will learn the key to exiting Seeker and entering the afterlife. The secret was also a part of the mysteries of Osiris, god of resurrection. Annually, the erection of pillars throughout Egypt symbolized his resurrection long ago when the forces of darkness attempted to kill him. Because the name Osiris was originally found among Egyptian archives from distant antiquity, the name supplanted the earlier title of the Messianic hero that taught that all people can enter into the afterlife by following his example. In the Book of the Dead, we read this amazing passage: I have entered Rostal. I have seen the hidden one who is therein. I was hidden, but I found the boundary. I journeyed to Neretref, and he who was therein covered me with a garment. This stunning passage reveals that the one God in Rostal is none other than Amen, the hidden one, and that he alone was remembered by the people as Osiris. For Neretref is the tomb of Osiris, god of resurrection. The secret herein is seen in that the God of resurrection does not need a tomb, but for to exhibit that it does not have any power over him or anyone believing in him. This Neretref is the King's Chamber, with its empty sarcophagus where the souls of the dead search for through the galleries of rock. All of the elements of the Arcanum are present here. The ability to see the hidden God is rewarded with the ability to be clothed with a garment, a new immortal body the tomb cannot contain. In the tomb of the hidden God is the boundary between heaven and earth and what the prophet Isaiah called the border to the Lord in the land of Egypt. In Rostal, the wise in death will seek the tomb and look upon the empty sarcophagus in the King's Chamber and believe that he has risen from the dead and has the power to offer all the life he now enjoys. This belief in the hidden one is the key to resurrection and the receiving of the garment, for without it one cannot pass the border at the end of this world. Such an idea dates back to Sumerian beliefs. The Sumerian goddess Inanna descended into the underworld by virtue of a pillar that she was not allowed to use after she adorned herself with a garment. In Sumerian, it is Pala. Intriguingly, the same word in Hebrew means miracle. The exact same story can be found in the Babylonian legends concerning Ishtar. who had to pass through 7 gates in her descent to the underworld. The Egyptian records claim that the Giza area was Rostal, and that Osiris, as god of resurrection, was the god of Rostal. In fact, the Sphinx stela of Thutmose IV refers to Giza as Rostal. The connection this pillar of the Sethites has with the Egyptian belief in resurrection and the Christian belief in resurrection through faith in the Son of God is fascinating. The Greeks